this brings us to the third section of this workshop here, which is equalization, right? As we've kind of discussed already, EQ is the balance of the tones and the timbres of the instruments in order to create a nice balance. There's a lot of different cheat sheets that are out there. This is one provided by Sweetwater. We do have some of our own here that we've hidden throughout the building strategically, of course. One of them is on the live stream desk that we use at the bridge, and there's another one that's tapered to the back of the iPad. But this is just kind of a brief overview of some of the instruments and obviously all of the quirky music labels that we like to add, things like weight and bloom and fundamental. No, actually that's scientific. That's a good one actually. But so these are some of the different labels. So maybe if you're hearing something, you can use the quick guide in order to be able to solve some issues, right? We will obviously spend a lot of time going into detail about this stuff, but that's going to be reserved for more of the practice session that we'll do at the end of the one that we hold on Saturday. So I hope that for those of you guys who come on Saturday, you get to have some hands-on experience, and we'll go way more into detail about this. What I want to spend a little bit more time on, though, is some of the terms when it comes to EQ and some of the practices, some of the mindset, the way that you should be thinking. How do I want to apply EQ? Where do I use EQ? That type of thing. So let's jump over here. Some of the tools that we have for EQ. So I'm using, first of all, this visual is from the FabFilter Pro Q. If you've ever worked the live stream, this is the EQ that we use in the live stream. So hopefully this should look somewhat familiar, right? But when it comes to EQ tools, we have a bunch of different types of EQ tools at our disposal. Most of you will probably be familiar with seeing jumps like this, okay? And you know, these are the most common ones. We'll talk about the other types in a second here. But when you're controlling these frequency boosts and or pulls, there are basically three parameters that you have to worry about. That's frequency, gain, and quality, or you might see it as Q for short, okay? So frequency, that's what we were talking about at the beginning of this seminar here. The frequency is obviously where on this graph that you're going to be controlling the frequencies that are coming through, okay? Gain, that's how much you're going to pull or how much you're going to add in a particular direction. And then finally there's quality, and I think this is one that trips up people quite a bit, right? So quality is basically how narrow or how wide the EQ you are going to affect is, okay? So for example, you can see in the middle of this graph are two much more narrow EQ bands. And these would have a high Q, all right, meaning that the quality is really, really high and it's only affecting that particular frequency and maybe just a few frequencies around it. As opposed to something like this, which is a little wider, okay? Wide Qs, that means that the quality is lower, therefore it's going to affect multiple frequencies all stacked around it in much more gradual ways, right? Kind of the general consensus is that high Q should be used for really precise really precise EQ stuff. So let's say, for example, that you were EQing a snare drum, or something that has a lot of ring to it, right? If there's a particular frequency that keeps ringing back in your snare drum or in your toms, you would likely want to use a very high Q because you don't want it to be apparent that you're pulling a huge section of the EQ out, right? You want to just get rid of and surgically remove that one ringing hard frequency, okay? You could also use this if you were getting feedback. Maybe you figure out exactly what frequency you're feeding back on, and so once you found it, you set the Q really, really high, and then you can pull that frequency, and it sounds very, very natural in that case, right? However, if you're just doing general EQ, just lifting of certain sections of an instrument, then you would want a much broader Q, right? Broad Qs are described as being more musical, okay? When you adjust EQ, for example, if I'm a guitar player, so I think of everything on the guitar first, right? But if I'm adjusting the EQ on a guitar, most guitar amplifiers have like a low, a mid, and a treble, and they're usually not very high cues like this. They're usually very, very broad, sometimes covering really huge bands. Like maybe a low-end frequency would be like 80 hertz to 300 hertz. You know, that's how many frequencies it's affecting. So it's a much more musical EQ, and you know, usually good for those types of applications. Next, we have shelf EQs. All right, so a shelf EQ basically means that you're going to affect all of the frequencies either above or below a certain location. So, for example, a high shelf EQ, which is what you're seeing here, is going to affect only the frequencies that are above a certain location. So it looks like here we're sitting right around like 3K, 3000 hertz, okay? And they're pulling everything that's above 3000 hertz down. It looks like about 6 or 7 decibels, right? This can be really useful if you're working on a part of an instrument, like maybe you want to bring out the brilliance of the cymbals of a drum kit. You could maybe add or boost a section above 8K to bring out some of the brilliance like that, okay? Or maybe you want to get rid of some of the low frequency. Maybe the piano player is getting a little heavy in the left hand, and you decide, you know what, I can't have them getting too muddy with the bass player. We're going to use a low shelf EQ, and we're going to make sure that anything below 100 hertz or 150 hertz, you know, pulls a little bit lower in the mix to make room so that way the bass player is still nice and clear. And then next here we have the high pass filter and the low pass filter. So on the soundboard, our Behringer X32s, we have an automatic low pass filter built in to every single channel. It's a guaranteed guaranteed tool that you have in front of you. And low-pass filters are probably way more common and way more useful than high-pass filters. There's only a small handful of scenarios I can imagine us using a high-pass filter on. But low-pass filters, they get rid of all of the low-end extra stuff that you probably wouldn't want, all right? Remember we talked at the beginning, we said that low frequencies have really wide bandwidths or really wide wavelengths. And so low frequencies, they jumble up really quickly and they can turn into an uncontrolled, garbled mess. And so it's really important for us to make sure that only the things we want being low are there. And so an easy example would be for a vocalist, right? When you're on stage, just because your vocalist doesn't sing anything lower than 120 hertz doesn't mean that frequencies that are lower than 120 hertz aren't going to make their way into the microphone. After all, the subwoofers are behind the stage. It's not, you know, it wouldn't be a shock if some of that subwoofer noise made its way back into the microphone. So how do you get rid of some of that? Well, you just roll off, or you use a low-pass filter, or excuse me, a high-pass filter to in order to get rid of all of that extra stuff, right? So high-pass filters, really, really useful. I have to correct myself. I just realized that I contradicted myself earlier here in the video. High-pass filters means that high frequencies pass through. Low-pass filters mean that low frequencies pass through. And so high-pass filters are what we mostly use. Sorry, I just realized I caught myself here in the middle of that video. Mike's shaking his head. Yes, yes, you did, Alex. All right. But there's lots of other examples, all right? As a guitar player, I know that my instrument doesn't go below 80 hertz, so if I make any extra weird hand noise or whatever, like we don't want that in the mix. So a guitar player, you can roll off everything below 80 hertz. Keyboard player, keyboards will go really, really low, but unless they're using like a synth bass for something, usually roll off at about 80 hertz. Even bass players, a bass guitar goes really, really low, but the fundamental frequency for a kick drum is around 40 to 50 hertz. And so even a bass guitar, you might roll off everything below 40 hertz to make sure you don't get any extra noise that you don't want. So high-pass filters, really, really useful. I can't overemphasize how good these tools can be to clean up a mix. Okay, so let's talk about the principles of mixing and the principles of EQ. What's the mindset that you're going to have, right? Number one is fix it at the source. I mentioned in the tools section that the musicians and the instruments were one of the tools that we have. And I'm coming back to that element one more time here, right? Let's say you have, an instrument that sounds really, really, let's just say muddy. I'll just use the broad term muddy, okay? What would be easier? Would it be easier for you to try and EQ all of that out so that way it doesn't sound so muddy? Or would it be easier to maybe talk to the musician and say, hey, is there some way, maybe a different setting or some sort of different patch that we can use to try and brighten you up a little bit and get rid of some of that low-end clutter? That's going to be the easiest solution every time. So number one, don't fix it in the mix if you don't have to. Fix it at the source. I think probably the best example of this that I ever came across was there's a producer out there named Chris Lord Alge. If you don't know who he is, I guarantee you've heard something that he's worked on. He is, like, when it comes to rock music and production, he is way high on the status of high-end producers, right? And there was a sound engineer who was working with him. He had never worked with him before, and he said he couldn't believe working with Chris Lord Alge how good it sounded before they even got to the mixing part. He had always been a fix it in the mix type of guy in the studio. Get it, 40% there, 30% there. We'll fix it all with tricks and production magic later on. He said when they got the final product, or when they got to the part right before they actually even started moving faders and doing EQ and mixing, he said the album sounded 90% like it had in the final project. So what would you rather have? Would you rather have to fix it later, or would you rather fix it at the source? I'd say fix it at the source every single time. Part two, subtract before you add. So the easy solution is not to add the frequencies that you want. It's to get rid of the stuff that you don't want, right? Carving things out is easier than trying to add stuff that you don't have later. And there's actually some scientific reasons for that. I won't get too terribly into it, but you can imagine that when the soundboard is EQing stuff, all right, it's really easy to just cut out stuff and get rid of things, all right, as opposed to artificially adding things later that don't actually exist. All right, it sounds much less natural, and it's usually a better. It doesn't mean that you can't add, right? Additive EQ does add is there for a reason, but subtracting before you add is usually the first step. Not the last step, right? And then finally, a place for everything, everything in its place, as Bob Zastro would say. Just again, re-emphasizing that idea of know where the instrument's strengths are. Try and, elevate, an instrument where it's strong and subtract from places that it's not strong. Make sure that you have kind of an idea in mind, going into it, saying, okay, I think this is where this guy's going to fit. It's not going to be perfect the first time, and maybe when you do all the instruments individually and then you stack them together, you realize, ooh, I think I might have made a mistake here. That's okay. That's going to happen, right? But try to carve out a place for everything so that way they all sit together. So now, oh, right, I'm missing a step here. EQ priority. What's supposed to stick out most, okay? The vocals. That's easily, if there's one thing you have to get right, if there's one thing you got right out of the entire thing, it would be the vocals. That should be your biggest priority, especially if it's the pastor, right? We hold typically around a 40 to 50-minute service here at the Bridge, and about 30 minutes of that is filled up by the pastor. It's the main content. It's the reason everybody is here, right? The band is secondary. If you have to get one thing right, it's learning how to get the pastor's mic right. But in the context of the band, the vocals, that's the thing that you have to get the most right, okay? They have to stand out. People have to be able to connect with them, sing them, understand them. We do have, obviously, some help, having things like the TVs and the projectors to add lyrics, but the vocals, that's the most important part. After that comes the drums, okay? The drums take up a lot of space, if I'm being honest, in a mix, right? They are like 70% of the energy that goes behind a band. They cover the lowest of the lows and the highest of the highs in the EQs, and therefore they kind of get a special place on top of the mix. So if you're not sure where to bring them, drums should definitely be way high on that list. And then finally, everything else. I know that at the beginning, the goal is going to be to figure out how to create good separation in a mix. But as you get better and as you start to become more mature in how you mix, then your goal afterwards is going to be, how can I get everybody to blend together nicely? Okay, so EQ priority, vocals have to be on top, followed by drums, and then bring everything else up to support it.